Alright, today's video is going to be a bit different. It's going to be notes Turdz sent me on the games he played in TW16, specifically in the finals. So I'm going to be reading from his notes, and I'm going to be commenting a bit and clarifying a bit because we didn't edit his notes all that well. That's on me. I also didn't give him great direction for what would be useful to turn into video, but I hope this comes out good. And I really wanted to get his thoughts on the match, and he sent his thoughts on each game as my videos came out on those games, so they helped remind him of what happened in each individual game. One downside of that was it meant he was often responding to things I said in the video, and I think there's a chance that because I'm a blabberer, that distracted him from maybe what he was thinking in the game, though I think he did a really good job of talking about what he was considering in game. But it also means a bunch of times he's responding to things I said, being like, well, you said this and that was clearly wrong. And he's right, I was clearly wrong, but sometimes he doesn't clearly say what he's responding to. And so hopefully we'll figure it out as we go. All right. So for game one, he says, okay, so I had a few hand ideas made and some deleted, and I had done quite a bit of prep, making a few hands with some slight tweaks, while also not trying to give away the locked card. So something really important to remember here is each player must lock in one card, and they can never switch off that card. So if your opponent knows which card you're locked into, they know a card they can always kind of work around, right? If you know your opponent is locked into one of the Yunas, for instance, they're probably locked into the other Yuna as well. Like, what else is going to pair as well with it? And so you want to line up well against the Yunas, you don't want to line up badly against them, right? Like, you might want to avoid eights left and right because they're easily picked off, or sevens up and down. But if you have sevens left and right and eights up and down, the Yunas aren't going to be hitting you for much damage. So knowing cards like that can really help um, figure out how you want to build counter hands and what's safe to do. Because if you see an opponent play a hand, they're somewhat always liable. Lots of players like to do this to kind of play the same hand but figure out a way to rotate it. But here, you're not going to really have options to rotate the hand. So if you do figure out kind of stuff like the sevens and eights I just talked about, that can be a really beneficial thing to have figured out and play against, especially if you know which cards your opponent is locked into. So Turd's saying he wants to not give away the locked card. I think obvious, this is not like super complicated, but obviously makes sense. He says, looks like I have six hands saved. Incidentally, my winning hand was a tweak and not one I have saved. One thing to note here is we will, in a bit, look at the hands he had saved, but he doesn't bring them up yet, so we won't look at them yet. The hand I started with was the one I felt most comfortable going in blind to the match with. As you called in your video, I was ensuring I could restrict safety by being able to target any number in any direction, while I got a feel for the rule set, and a first view of what stuff was going to do. And we can see Turd's hand has an A in all four directions, so he knows he has some ability to fight anything below an A, and it also has double numbers facing all four corners. And so he knows he will be able to handle whatever he sees. He's clearly choosing a somewhat more reactive hand. I talked about this in the game, I think I called this correctly, but choosing a hand where he knows there's nothing that's going to completely screw me that I'm not going to be able to deal with. And one thing that gave Stuff difficulties in this first game was Turdz got to start with this safe corner because Stuff did not have all four corners covered the same way. He had most things covered and could set up against a lot of things, but not everything. And Turdz made sure he'd have everything covered without even needing to set up against it, just knowing he couldn't get screwed on that front. Which is something I have a lot of sympathy for doing, though I personally don't do it as much as I used to. Not sure that's right, but um, uh, that six hands doesn't include a couple of deleted attempts, including double Yuna. Could have been a very odd series of games if we both used them and one of us had to blink first to change. This reminds me that I had a conversation with Turdz at the start of TTA and when I was looking at the hands chosen in the first tournament back, and it was just very clear that when people could choose a pair of cards, or there was a split level rule set where you get two high levels, people are much like 2 to 1 more likely, something like that, to pick A's up and down than to pick A's left and right. People like up and down visually more than they like left and right. And if you want something that doesn't line up, on average, you should pick left-right rather than up-down. Specifically on level 10, there were other weird psychological quirks on other levels. But on level 9 and 10, A's up and down tend to be preferred to left and right. Interestingly, in this series, we saw both players' main A9 pairs be left and right. But if you are looking to dodge things, on average, you want to go left and right. And if you want your cards to line up with theirs, you probably want to go up and down. I did not expect to have a safe corner starter. I noticed straight away that he had no A's down, so wanted to start on the bottom, but actually was a bit worried about Larsa and Uber. Thought Uber might have a lot of play. But as I looked at it properly, I realized 7 is just safe, and he doesn't really have a great response. So yeah, kinda as you say, I thought I had the hand advantage early on, and after he went 9, I think he played Yuna in 9, it felt pretty sensible to just go in 8. I agree. 2 cards safe to 1, and the opponent has to build out. And the opponent's card isn't even safe yet, so it's hard to not just block 6. After 6, what card went in 6? I think it was 868. Yes. After 6, I spent a lot of time on Hydaelyn in 3, thinking it looked strong. Ruled out any replies he had in 5 as losing, then kept going. And yeah, you called it. At the time I played it, I thought it was winning. Didn't take long into Stuff's time for me to notice what I'd missed. Larsa 4 set up a plus in 5 against 8 with Uber. Without that, it looked like a clear win. Because I thought it was winning, I spent too much time on it, so wouldn't have found anything else. Not sure I'm saying I would have found the win in 1, which was found by Seto. What a jerk. Not saying I would have found the win in 1 if I had my time again. It's a bit of a tricky one, but I do play 1 in that position on occasion. Just didn't feel the need to check it here, as I was already sure about 3. So a bit gutted about that. You mentioned my kind of cryptic message about a slight miscalc. Yeah, I'd already worked out every other move of his as losing, but not quite as perfect play as you called. Always a risk in that kind of position. If I missed a tie, I could have easily missed a loss. I'm going to disagree on that. I think there are positions where, and maybe this wasn't one of those positions, so I'm sort of disagreeing generally, but maybe in specific it's wrong. Because in this kind of position, the combos can line up, and because 8 is weak to 7 and 6 is weak to 3, if combos start lining up wrong, things can go really wrong, even though they look really favorable right now. But there are lots of positions where, like, you have checked enough to know a move can't lose, and you haven't checked everything, but there's nothing you haven't checked that could be scary enough to beat you. And I would suggest this position might be one of those situations where even if you're wrong and this isn't winning, I'm not sure this is a position you're losing if you've checked setup options and you know that if 5 isn't taken, you can block 5 without setting them up in 2 or without setting them up in 4, depending on what squares are left open. And I think given that's the case here, I think a miscalc can't be losing in this kind of position. So I'm going to slightly disagree. I'm going to say, no, it is a better play than Turdz is claiming here. And I think missing a tie does not necessarily have the implication that you could have missed a loss, right? There are some situations where you miss a tie and you go, oh shit, I might be losing. And then you realize, no, it's just a tie. But there are lots where you miss a move and you go, oh, am I not actually winning? And that's like the worry there. And I think that's probably more the case here. But yeah, I came out of game 1 thinking I was definitely ahead on the hands. And I think Turdz was ahead on the hands here. We saw him both have safety here, but also, as I mentioned repeatedly in my videos, the incidental combos really favor the A9-7-3s over the A9-6-4s. Just because the 7-3 lines up to plus wall the 6, right? The 7 is side to side and the 6 is side to side. The 3-9 is up down and a 4 is up down, so it lines up there. And the A9-6-4s don't have anything that lines up in the same way, right? If the 3-7-9As were 7-3-9As, it would be completely different, because suddenly the 7s would face up and down and the A9-6-4s would play against them. And now suddenly I think the A9-6-4s would probably be favored in the matchup. And I talked about this a lot in my videos, but I think this is a huge part of building counter hands, is if you realize someone is locked in on 2 cards, one kind of very straightforward thing to do, and something done regularly in this match, is to say, okay, I'll pick like a double number in both directions, or, depends on the level, but maybe like, if you see 7 6s or whatever, a 6 3 6 3 could cover two 7 6 opposite corners. Something that says, I can fight the strong sides of these. But another thing that can be really valuable is to say, can I just pick something where I slightly tweak my numbers and it lines up well, right? Not that 739As exist, but if someone was running 739As, if they did exist, noting, okay, Yunas line up pretty well against that. Suddenly they hit the A964 part, and you can do damage with that. And I think just realizing, like, what gives me an advantage on the backside of cards, and this gets more and more important as you get higher level, is a really useful way to think about counter hands. And something I really focused on more after Tezuka beat me in a hand match for something. All right, let's move on to Turdz's Game 2 notes. I think I remembered to write the game number at the top of the thing on every screen but one. So hopefully didn't miss it too much. Game 2. So into Game 2, I wasn't surprised he changed his hand. He had to do something about my starter from Game 1. You'll notice stuff now does have an A in each direction, and I think 7-6-A6 is a really nice pairing with the Yunas. It can play off the 6s and the A's really well, and the 9 facing down. And sometimes, if you're having trouble hitting 8s, it can combine with the 4 to hit some 8s. I think a very powerful combination. It didn't end up playing well in this game, but a combo I really like. One hand I personally quite like is 2 Yunas, A6 7-6 and 7-6 A6, that pair, and then just whatever utility card you want. I think I've run it with 8-8 7-6s and 8-8 6-6s is the fifth, but you could vary. It has an A in every direction. It's a little soft tie side to side. It's easy to run out of power there, but if you handle it well, it can plus almost any of the numbers that it has trouble normally taking. I think it's quite powerful. Anyway, so into Game 2, I wasn't surprised he changed his hand. He had to do something about my starter from Game 1. 7-6-A6 wasn't a card I was expecting. I thought about horizontal and vertical sweepers, and you referenced it today in the Game 3 video that my hand was a bit weak side to side, which is to say it has an A in each direction side to side, but as soon as that goes away, and we saw this a lot during the match, it tends to run out of power to take, 8s and 9s and other stuff facing side to side, except when lined up exactly right. I was very aware, but I felt throughout that prioritizing corner double numbers over horizontal verticals had a bigger threat. So Game 2, that wasn't the starter I was expecting. Let's play the starter. But I guess he too realized he didn't really want that card, given it didn't appear again in the match. I would have liked to see it more, actually, just not as a starter. I was drawn to the capture in 6 pretty quickly, actually. I think maybe I captured starters less than others, but it felt good here. Probably noticed first that he couldn't take the A up. Explore it more, he doesn't really have a good recapture in 8, even though he uses Yuna to set his other Yuna up. It sets me up better. Which is to say, Yuna now has the same wall in 7, but Turdz has 5, and Turdz can work on setting up 7 if he wants to. So any recaps in 8 or 5 looked like they were very good, maybe winning for me. I noticed Yuna in 3, but thought it was kind of fine, and I'd have a way of playing around it. But then he played it, and, oh, actually this is pretty uncomfortable. Capturing it with Bini looked like a tie at best, but maybe losing. Something like this looked quite scary, because Stuff has successfully built out a wall of 2 cards, and Turdz suddenly has 2 cards that need defending. So he's up 6-4, but he has a lot more to defend. He can't capture. He has to put another card on board. It's easy to be in trouble in that kind of position, right? Where you're ahead on score, but behind on secured cards. Took a cursory glance at playing on the left, but didn't feel good about anything. So next was, can I lock in any cards or set any new threats? Which I think is how I arrived at Hydaelyn in 5. It locked in 6, set up a different type of threat in 2, but I was pretty accepting of the tie at that point. It wasn't a very easy card for me to recapture. Incidentally, I think I might have been more likely to find the win in 8, if it locked in 9. Oops, didn't mean to dump eval. The win's here. Um, in other words, I'd not spent long looking at it, as it didn't feel optimal to play a card that could set up combos. Yeah, so this move ends up being the win, and you can see how just dominant it makes 3/7/9A. But also, it's very instinctive to play moves. If you're going to play in 5 or 8 locking in a card, like, it's a lot riskier to play with something that overpowers the cards you're locking in, such that it's not a lock in at all, and you're at high combo risk. Here, we can think of 5 and 7 as a pair. If you leave them open, you can always meet one with the other, but you can't always control that. I can definitely see being scared off this move and wanting to go for something that's much safer in the sense that it happily locks in a card while also managing to create threats and set stuff up. What I noticed after you called it out as a win is that actually he didn't really have any good ways to set up those combos against it, so I shouldn't have been so worried about it. But after 5, I actually had to be a bit careful. Tied it fairly comfortably in the end, but I didn't feel as ahead game 2, as you maybe indicated in your commentary. How did the game end on this one? 2, 8. Yeah, clumsy stuff hanging out. 1, and Larsa sweeps for the tie. Alright, on to game 3. Game 3, for the first 4 moves, went basically as you called it. How did it go for the first 4 moves? 3/7/9A here. This was the Larsa 7 game? Yes. Where Turdz locks in 9 here. But even though both 1 and 5 are capturable, they're not going to both end up captured, and stuff can build a kind of wall facing up that won't be uncapturable, but leaves 9/5/5/9 as a kind of dead card, and that's just enough to get the tie here. I was honestly surprised how quickly you jumped to 6 after 7, meaning after Larsa in 7 going 6 to lock in 9, but I pretty much did the same in game. It was my priority move. Shuya in 8 was pretty tricky in the end. It was better than I'd given it credit for. I think the way the move grew on you kind of happened with me too. Incidentally, before you played it, you said the likely response was Vanille in 5. I was pretty sure that was losing. I'm sure you can confirm. Yeah, indeed, this was losing, and this shows that running out of that downward power really left Turdz with dead cards at the end. It is a really interesting feature of something that I guess it can happen in all kinds of positions, but in hand games, it sort of often happens when you put a card in the corner that it's not a natural fit in. You find your hand is like slightly unbalanced for the rest of the game. You start 3/7/9A and 9, the game is kind of down facing, and suddenly one of your 2 good cards facing down is already out of your hand. And stuff did a really nice job this game making it down facing, and there were even potential lines like this, which, as Turdz mentions, I got wrong in my analysis, where you run out of the downward power and are just dead in endgames. And this 9/5/5/9 really was super dead here. Since you put it in the solver anyway, 9/6/4A and 4 looked bad, but I couldn't take anything. I then couldn't take anything. Yep, and that is correct. That is the problem. So you said here how bad the 9/9/5/5s were playing. I felt it wasn't great here either. Pretty sure I switched away from 9/5/5/9 in game 4. Correct me if I'm wrong. We will see shortly. Though in fact, we can quickly take a peek. He did. And I think that was correct to do. And I think we'll move on to game 4 now. Actually, game 4 was the one where I felt closest to losing, but I also felt like I majorly turned it around. I'll not say any more about game 4 until I've watched it back, in case I'm thinking of the wrong one. What else? Oh yeah, my hand swaps in game 3. Oh no, I've closed it, so now we don't have it visually. I'm sorry about that. But you could open another version of the video and go to the position if you want to look at something said now. And probably why I ended up with 9/5/5/9. One of my initial hand builds was basically my first hand, with 9/5/5/9 instead of 6/8/8/6, and I didn't like it as much going into game 1, but the switch was really about making threats against his hand. So he switched off 9/5/5/9 here. Oh no, we're still talking about switches from the last game, sorry. Shadow hit the 9s on both Yunas. Yep, we can look at Shadow, because he switched from 8/4/7/7 to 8/6/7/7. And so he gives up his A up, but he's making sure, yeah, he can hit the 9s on both Yunas, and also Larsa's A's in their comfortable spots. So he's really building like very much I want things covered based hands. And I think I didn't quite notice that. I think I just didn't notice that when watching these games, or at least specifically on the Shadow switch, that Shadow is very much designed to even more cover the things stuff is doing. Um, and running both 6886 and 8677 just felt like too much of a raw power concession. So 9559, having its doubled numbers while also having a little more power on its strong side, possibly filled that gap. As you said, I didn't have an A955 option for that corner. If everything was rotated, I'd probably have picked Fafnir as a Don. And yeah, the other thing I noticed about his hand game 3, you didn't mention it, but he basically had 2 cards for the same corner in Yuna and Shuyin, and we see the same hand used by stuff in game 4, so we can still see that here. Was kind of surprised by that, but actually the 998s made me a little uncomfortable. I was glad he dropped Uber after game 1. Larsa was basically a powerhouse that I wanted out of his hand every game, but also he played it early game 3, and that didn't really help me. I think he maybe had a slight edge game 3 in the end. I mean, watching it back, it looks like a pretty standard tie, but I don't think move 5 was entirely trivial. See earlier comment about Vanille in 5. If you're interested, here were my initial hand ideas, some of which ultimately were never going to get used after a couple of actual games played. Hand 2 is a bit of a cheat. I deleted my initial hand 2, which was the double Uno one previously mentioned, the one I made after the first 2 games. So I'm going to pop us over to look at his hands in a moment. But I wanted to say, I remember in an interview with Piggy Man, I think it was during his incredible TTAC run to the finals, where he and Tezuka did a lot of discussion during the whole tournament with each other about different strategies, and they ended up both making the finals. And that's probably the sort of greatest, not like cooperative, because like they weren't like sharing everything, but like in conversation run of 2 players we've ever seen. Now, maybe I'm more impressed by Piggy Man's run than you are, but he absolutely slaughtered me in round 2, so I'm impressed. I think it was an awesome run. And Piggy, one thing he mentioned, I think during interviews around that, was he quite likes, like, there's always the question of how do you build a 5-card hand when a 4-corner hand feels so good? What do you do with the 5th card? And one thing you can do is a horizontal or a vertical. And another thing you can do is a kind of utility card. Sure, it has a little more power facing some directions than others, but like a 6886 is not so much about its corner power, it's about its plus wall ability against lots of different things, right? And so there's kind of the standard 2 things to do are put a horizontal or vertical card as the 5th, or a card that is more a utility card, maybe a card you want to land in 5 that sets up stuff, or maybe a card that just covers a lot of stuff via plus wall and is not so much about its corner value, so that it provides a different value to the hand. And Piggy mentioned that he quite likes 4 corners plus a 5th corner. And the reason for that is, if you can start with that 5th corner, you can either put it in its natural, you can put it in any corner and you will have a balanced hand after. So one thing he quite likes is taking that extra corner and using it as a weak corner. You have a balanced hand after, you have power still facing that corner. Because the thing is, if you look at a hand like this and you say, okay, let's look at, say, Turdz' hand. Or let's look at, let's look at Turdz' hand. He has, a corner for 7, corner for 3, corner for 1. Let's call this a corner for 9, and a sort of extra corner for 1. If Turdz did something like starting here, okay, it's not Turdz' first turn, but if Turdz started with something like this, Shadow in 1, I'm not sure if it shows when I hover over a card, but I think it does. If Turdz was to play something like Shadow in 1, like, his hand is just really bad at facing it. He has a lot of cards that don't want to do that. But if you look at Stuff's hand, Stuff has cards for each corner. Yuna for 1, Yuna for 9, Shuyin also for 9, Larsa for 7, Ayla for 3. If Shuyin goes in any corner, then you're left with 4 corners, right? Or if Yuna, but probably Shuyin, goes in any corner, you're left with 4 corners, and you're left with a kind of balanced hand. So you're sort of looking to think, Can I play the strong corner? Okay, maybe that doesn't work so well here. If all else fails, I'm quite happy playing a weak corner, and I think Piggy doesn't mind either. And maybe you have some options to just check for sort of half strong corners as well. Occasionally, I mean, I'd call it Shuyan in 3 a relatively strong corner, but Shuyan in 7 is definitely a half strong corner. But you kind of have 4 starters in mind, and you know you'll have a pretty balanced hand afterwards. And unlike a sort of like, say, a horizontal card, how many corners can a horizontal card start in? Well, it could start in all 4, but it kind of does the same thing in each of the 4, right? Say it's side to side. If 1 and 7 are covered, like if 1's covered, 7's likely to be covered as well. If 3 covered, 9 is likely to be covered. This sort of does different things in each corner, so it actually gives you 4 kind of distinct looks at a starter. Anyways, I've gone way astray here, but I think Piggyman said some really interesting things about running the 5-corner hand. And obviously, Piggy is a creative hand maker in many ways and tends. I really think it was Piggy talking about this. But now I'm thinking, what if it was Tezuka or Deli around that time? But I think it was Piggy. And like Piggy likes kind of center starter hands and cards built around playing off each other in ways that don't necessarily fit this. But it's a really interesting concept and definitely worth thinking about if you're wondering what to do with your 5th card in a tournament hand. So all right, let's look at his hands. I'm gonna pull this over, and you should be able to see now. I can't check if you can, but let's just assume you can. Should be able to see the hands. Not that big, but we can see them. So we can see the hand he started with is the first hand here, right? And then he switches into Shadow instead of A477, which lines up better with the 9s up and down, as well as the 9559. And then he also has a version where he still has the A477, but goes with the 9559. So very much thinking, what 77 do I want? 8677 or A477? What utility card do I want? Is it a 6886 or a 9559? All right, let's see what other comments he wants. And these were never going to get used, but looking at ways of potentially changing out one of the A973s without giving away what my locked card was. Ultimately, though, not having direct opposites would be a concession, so I didn't use them. So these are the next few hands saying these were never going to get used. But Turdz's hero card was his Vanille, the 77A5. He was not committed to his A973s, so something he considered was I could swap out one of the A973s, make it look like my hero is the other A973, and see if there's anything useful to do there. So that's when he came up with these concepts. But we can see, and I think he mentions this, or will mention this shortly, that like A973 and 469A just don't feel like as good a fit. It does allow him to run Fang and Vanille, right? It allows him to switch into a different pair. But I think I agree with him. It didn't feel as powerful. And you can see with that top hand, he's very much going 4 corners and a side-to-side card. But yeah, switching, because in this rule set you were only allowed 1 pair of cards, switching off using the 2 A973s also frees him up to do things like a Celesteira pair, which both players in the finals have talked about and sort of considered, but didn't think were quite powerful enough. I really like Celesteira. I think one of their biggest weaknesses is people run Squall Cypher and they line up so badly against Squall Cypher, right? In the same way I've talked about these incidental combos, Cypher 6-9-A-4, the 6-4 can pick off the 8 facing down, the 6 and A can pick off the 6s facing up and down, the 9 and 4 can pick up the 5. It's one of those matchups where every incidental combo goes one way or the other. And so, like, Squall Cypher destroys Celesteira. But Vormav Meliaduel, the A873 pair from FF Tactics, actually is really good against Squall Cypher, because the 7-3s pick up 6s, the 8-7s pick up the 9s. Those line up really well. But Vormav Meliaduel are absolutely crushed by Yuna Yuna, because Yuna Yuna, the 6-4s pick up the 8s, the 9-6s pick up the 7s, all the plus walls go Yuna's way, and so Yuna crushes Vormav Meliaduel, Vormav Meliaduel crushes Squall Cypher crushes Celesteira, And Celesteira matches up really well against Yuna, right? The the A6 part can hit Yuna's sixes. Now Yuna can hit back on A6s there as well, but the 6/5s pick up the nines. Like Yuna doesn't do so badly there. It's not as dominant a matchup, but like Celesteira, I think, is slightly favored against the Yunas. And you can sort of build these wheels of things that are favored against other things, where like A8 7 3s, if they line up right, do beat A9s, even though A9s are a better card. And that's a lot of what I mean by just lining up things slightly different to get better hand matchups. Of like, in this match, the A9 7 3s are just favored against the Yunas. Now, it was hard for stuff for lots of reasons to figure out where to go from here, but a really tough matchup and something really worth thinking about, specifically for tweaking your hand when you see an opponent's hand, especially if you think there's a chance they will stick with it. And most people, assuming they didn't get in trouble, are likely to rerun a hand. I mean, I certainly am, and I'm more of a hand tweaker than most. So just something worth thinking about. What else do we got here? So we have the Celesteira hand, and we also have, what's the sixth hand? Another one where Euram is paired with the 4/6/9A, but instead of a side to side as we see in the hand 4, hand 6 uses a 3/9/9/8, sort of doubling up on the corner. But Vanille is not that strong a corner card. It's more sort of an up down wants to be on the left card. All right. Let's see what other notes we've got. I did consider the Celesteira or variation slightly. They would have targeted the Yunas in a different way, but just couldn't see moving off of A9s as being beneficial. Note pain in my thinking. Pain being the card 6959, not the word pain. Not necessarily just for the hand listed, but that was my recognition of my possible side-to-side weakness you referenced in today's video. But again, I thought having a hand I feel comfortable playing with was more important than picking a horror-vert card just to fill a gap that doesn't actually fit well. One general point I'd noticed in the game so far and throughout, and again you slightly referenced it today, is he didn't really have a good way to deal with my 7s. In the end, I'm glad I didn't run the FF13 girls as a pair though, a pretty common pairing I think, but it wasn't worth giving up a direct opposite pair of A9s for. That's about it for now, I think. Alright, so we move on to the next game, which is the one we've had up for a while because I mistakenly closed game 3 way too early. 3998, as you see above, was a card I'd already looked at when making initial hands. I think the switch was kind of prompted by me realizing after one game of running 9559 it wasn't getting enough play and I was running out of horizontal, particularly rightward power. And he was starting to load up on 9/9s, and I felt like I should have an opposite to Shu Yin. So going into game 4, I thought I'd make a good swap out. Of course, I'd given up one of my double numbers, so now X2 Yuna in 1 was a better starter option for him. Right, this is the first game where Turdz does not have AAs facing all corners. So I had a card in 3998 that I really liked, but already I was struggling for uses for it. And 2 3s on the top felt really redundant. I wish I'd spent longer checking moves in 3 here. I think I'd kind of realized Hydalen in 9 was always going to be annoying for him if he didn't adjust his hand and had an option had it as an option to fall back on. Yeah, I've watched it back now, and Game 4 was definitely the one. I felt least comfortable in. Let's put a few more moves on board. This was kind of our key position. The 1/9/4/6 play, meaning the cards in the board you see here, actually worked out quite comfortably for me. I actually had a lot of threats against a lot of moves he could play. I'd not specifically spotted the quirk that Larsa could plus off Shuyin in 2, which gave him a comfortable tie-in the end. You can see a goofy plus in 3 for Larsa. But I was definitely starting to feel like I was losing my advantage and not getting my hands quite right. So after game 4, I had a bit of a rethink. What was I really trying to achieve with 8677 and 3998 or 9559? 8677 was not optimal in terms of strength card, but its purpose was mostly targeting Yuna's 9s with a few other benefits. But was there a better way I could achieve that? And so A954s came to mind. I looked for 1 first, but nothing lined up how I liked. But then for 9, there was Lock. Shh! Seto may have prompted that. I talked hands a little with him after game 4, and I said I wanted an A954 that lines up. He said lock works. I would have gotten there anyway, as I was checking all options. Man, goddamn that Seto, always interfering. So anyway, added lock for shadow. Oh sweet, that also gives me A's in all directions again. But not many double numbers. But for balance now, needed a right-facing card, so bring back 6886. I was happy with how this hand looked, and then didn't change again. I think it helped me regain some advantage. Lock ultimately didn't get used quite how I intended. It had another benefit. It was actually safe, or close to safe, in quite a few positions. So this is something I made some guesses as to why Turdz switched to lock, and I was almost entirely wrong. His reasoning here was thoroughly different from the reasoning I gave. It would have been funny if I had called, I bet he switched to this because Seto said so, which, not usually a good guess, but would have been funny. Anyhow, I need to watch games 5 and 6 back to remember which is which, but I think game 5 it was, after my usual Hydalen and 9, which did indeed become Turdz's go-to here. Lock in 6 was super hard for him to touch. Oh, one thing I wanted to add about game 4. Again, I've closed a game too early, and also, sorry, this one doesn't say game 5. This is the one I forgot to include. It's saying that on the board. One thing I wanted to add about game 4, and maybe the cards I had, I wasn't comfortable early game, but I feel like 6 was kind of a swing back my way. 3998 and 8677 actually had a lot of threats against him. 2 was relatively simple in the end. You found it, he found it, but he couldn't play anything safely in 3, 5, or 7. Again, you can go back to the position we had after 1946 in the last game. Again, sorry I closed it. My bad. Anything in 5 let me flip 1. Most things in 3 did as well. I also had a plus in 5 that might have come into play. So when you talk about games that flip from one way to the other, I kind of think it was. Yes, overall, it was objectively a more balanced game than what preceded it, and was a clear tie, but I feel like I flipped it to being higher pressure on him than it initially appeared. Okay, I've watched Game 5 and the start of Game 6 back now, and I think that's enough to comment further on, considering I remember the final games well enough. Again, I'll try not to refer to the videos too much, though you said something relevant for Game 6 I'll probably refer to. So Game 5 as mentioned, I wanted to find a better balance to my hand after experimenting with 3998 in the previous game. It's a card I liked, but I felt it didn't work well with my hand overall, and he kind of punished the fact I dropped some of my double numbers with his starter in Game 4. Lock was the solution I found to a few issues. I wanted an A954 specifically to put threats on the 9s that had a bit more raw power than Shadow. Lock filled that gap, also gave me back an A in all directions. Actually, turned out to be a strong defensive card too. And bringing back 6886 gave the hand a bit more balance and also covered the other side of both Yunas. So into Game 5, I was looking for a few starters, but honestly the 379A and 9 that had become a bit of a staple early move for me still looked the most appealing, after checking a few other options. The fact that it was half safe and Lock basically threatened anything worth playing in 6 made it look very strong. So he replied with the same move in 1. I wasn't 100% sure what he'd do, but thought either that or Larsa 7 were likely again. Both had worked well enough in previous games. But here's where I saw the extra and kind of unintended benefit of Lock. He was completely safe in 6. And there wasn't really a reply that set up a huge threat in 2 or 8 either, and I had 3 pretty well covered. As I wasn't really sure what he was going to do, I felt like I was in a strong position at that point. Incidentally, this is a complete tangent. After the game, you revealed his only real tie was Yuna in 4. I didn't consider that as a candidate option for him, but once you mentioned it, I noticed something you didn't comment on. It set up a plus for Ayla in 5, which would probably force me to block 5. I think that's the real reason it held. It does not set up a plus in 5. Alright, so Turdz had 1 blindness here. Sets up a plus for, doesn't set up 5. Maybe he means a different position or something. But Larsa in 7 surprised me a bit. Not sure why at this stage, when I'd already seen it as his possible first move, but actually it too was safe as it stood. Why won't you let me move the cards? Alright, there we go. So I thought actually this looks pretty good from him, but there must be a way I can still press. But everything I looked at either seemed a clear tie or a bit messy. Incidentally, sorry I haven't been going to the ends of games in these videos. I've sort of just been following his commentary. If you want to see the entire games, they are almost all recorded on video, and you can, even if you don't want to like watch through me talking, you can easily skip around the video to see what moves happen to finish the game. Um, but everything I looked at either seemed a clear tie or a bit messy. I think I started in 3. The problem was he started in 2, but the problem was I was starting to run out of directional power. Oh, started thinking in 3. That makes sense. So I thought he could just survive that comfortably. So was there any clever setup? Urim in 5 started looking interesting. Very interesting. But there's so much to calculate there, I think I lost a bit of time on it. It didn't quite work. But then I started to notice how much Urim could threaten his hand in general, and if I could keep hold of it now, I could maybe stop him from ever playing in 5, as it just had combo potential against anything he did. So Yuna in 5 is of course plus walled by Urim in 8, Ayla in 5 is samed by Urim in 8, and 8678 in 5 is plussed by Urim in 8. So it's very hard for stuff to occupy 5, and Urim can really be a good sweeper here. So I ended up looking at 2, actually got to that move quite late, but the first glance told me he definitely couldn't take the move he wanted in 4, and actually if he went 3, I could work it from there, because you can go 4 there and force him to allow Urim to sweep that endgame. Actually, fine, I'll mention one of your comments here. You were right, I think all of us miscalced 3 there. So, Stuff ended up playing this tie in 8, which I thought was the best move, but I had missed that you actually do tie in 3 if you just counted out 3 as a tie, and I had predicted that both Stuff and Turdz had also miscounted 3. I'm not sure Stuff did, but Turdz here is admitting that he at least did as well. I'll admit it, I thought 3 was out for him when I played 2, but by the time he'd picked up a card, I'd seen it, but it was difficult to see it working. I think if all 3 of us didn't see it at the time, the 3 holds here, of me making the move, it means the move was still good. Actually, in truth, I think 2 was perhaps the most careless move I made all match. The fact I missed things here means it could have been worse than it was. Now, this is a position where I think if you're missing things here, things can go a little more wrong just because it's so chaotic. Though I don't think they can go that wrong with you having as strong a sweeper as Urim. So again, I don't think there were losing chances here. But anyway, back to Turd's comments. Incidentally, I also hope it's clear when I'm reading from Turdz and when I'm talking. Voices naturally make changes when reading versus talking, and when hopping from one viewpoint or character to another in something. So I hope it's clear, and I apologize at all moments where it just sort of blends together and it's not obvious whether I am speaking or whether Turdz is, but it would be kind of annoying for me to go, Turdz says every time Turdz speaks, and in my opinion, as me, not Turdz, every time I speak. Alright, back to Turdz. Okay, I did do it there. But actually, I stand by it being strangely strong, even though there were so many ties against it. In the end, 8 held comfortably enough anyway. I'd hoped I might be able to press for a win in Game 5, to be honest. But after you revealed the actual win, I think of the 3 wins I've missed so far, if I'd had my time again, that'd be the one I'd be least likely to have found in real time. Notice in my own commentary, I didn't mention 8 at all for turn 5. So the win here was something in 8. Don't remember what, though. Well, we can find out. Dump eval. What you got for me? 6, 8, 8, 6, and 8. That's the win. Alright. I hadn't spent it long enough looking at it to think anything there could possibly win, but I definitely felt like I was getting ahead again after a couple of tougher games, and was finally happy with my hand and how it matched up. Right, so unless you have any questions, I think that's Game 5 wrapped up, so on to Game 6. Alright, I will close this one. And we both clearly found our ideal hands at this point. I felt I still had the slight advantage mind. So we played the same starter in 1. It was starting to feel that he was committed to that, and I must have felt at this point I needed to find something different, otherwise this was never going to quite get over the line. And putting Urim in 9 instead, seeing it back, even though he could attack both sides, I had really good recap coverage, meaning if something takes it, you almost always have ways to combo back that capture, right? Locke with just incredible use. Locke really ended up being the MVP of this this match. It was also a way to try to keep a bit more left power, which I was obviously losing every time I played Hydaelyn early game. So again, think he had to be careful to find something. It's actually a pretty good move in 2. I assume he'd carefully calculated it out, Lock in 6 looked like it set up Vanille so well, but it didn't take me long to figure out if he went in 3 it was going to lead to a tie. I couldn't take Vanille back from 8, so having seen that quite quickly, I used the rest of the time to look for other moves. Nothing seemed as appealing, it just felt like the right move to make. But I started to look at something, and this is relevant. What about Vanille in 7? Similar setup to how he played in the last game, actually. Gave me a different option in 4, might force him to block 4, could be interesting. But it was way too complicated a setup for me to have calced out properly, so I just decided to take the standard move, take the tie, and rethink. So the comment I wanted to mention, you'd suggested Vanille in 7 as a candidate move against his starter, way back here. I hadn't gotten there myself yet, but having started to look at it later in Game 6, it planted that seed in my mind, considering it here. This is something I think good players do, and something also really useful in chess, but is you see an idea somewhere and you start to apply it at other points in your thinking. Because if it exists somewhere, there's a very good chance it exists elsewhere as well. And finding an idea, even if it doesn't work, doesn't mean that idea isn't valuable or useful. And sort of the more compelling ideas you find in a position, the more you have potential concepts in as you go down variations for surprising or appealing ideas to come down the road in those. Yeah. So going into Game 7, all right, we'll close this one. After his usual starter in 1, I went there straight away, and it actually looked really good. If he didn't block 4 straight away, I had one card that owned the left side of the board. I didn't see any good 3-corner setups for him, and I wanted Larsa out of his hand, really. I went for it, knowing he couldn't really capture an 8 either, because I had that well covered. Lock in 9 comboed if he captured with Yuna, and also was safe. Larsa was covered by Hydaelyn. I've mentioned this before in our other games, but I always really wanted Larsa out of his hand, and I thought this might be a way to tease it out. So he did block 4, and out of the few possible candidate moves, I think the L in either 8 or 2 would be feasible. I settled on the capture in 5. Felt like a very high pressure move that he couldn't seriously threaten. I didn't quite think it would be winning, but I also didn't find a tie for him. I thought 8, 6, 7, 8, and 6 might do it, but in 7 minutes I'd hopefully find a response. But basically, 8 was out for him completely now. Lock could always just be safe in 9. 2 just gave me setups, I think, although Yuna in 2, And Yuna in 2 does end up being the tie, but it's because, like, 8, 6, 7, 8 randomly plus walls the 9 facing up in the critical variation. I do not blame Stuff at all for playing 8, 6, 7, 8 rather than 9, 6, 4A and 2 here, because 9, 6, 4A is useful to hold on to in lots of lines, and 8, 6, 7, 8 is useful to hold on to in exactly 1, but it happens to be the one that matters most. He did actually go 2 in the end with 8, 6, 7, 8. For a couple of minutes, I thought he might have actually found the tie. The win was not quite as easy to find as I'd have liked. I think this is where the switch to Lock won me the game, to be honest. I've already mentioned how powerful he'd be in 9 for the whole game, but the incidental combos also came into play in the endgame calculation. He hit Yuna's 4, as well as the 9, but the 4 hard. So I could nestle 6, 8, 8, 6 in 8, and he either couldn't flip in 9 or 6, or play safely enough in 3. And I'd done it. Such a grueling match that I had to be at the very top of my game to finally find the breakthrough. It was a very good finals match, in my opinion, and to have a great match, you need 2 great players. I've talked far too much about myself, so let's give some credit to Stuff, because he deserves a huge amount of it. Firstly, for his run to the finals in the first place. I thought he'd have a decent enough run, predicted him to quarterfinals, I think, before losing to Smokes. But actually, to come through that match with Smokes, which I will add was super grueling, which if it isn't a tie record, it probably should be. Probably is. Unfortunately, we'll never know, but let's just say it is. On a weird rule set as well, he finally broke through. Then I caught the match with Vid. He played that excellently. I almost miscalculated Vid's madness at the end, thought he might have had a sting in the tail move 7 in 4, but it didn't set enough up. Stuff got it just right. And now in the finals match itself, he put up a really big fight. First couple of games I was pressing, but he always found just enough to tie. Even if I may have missed a couple of wins, the fact that he usually made the moves that were your instincts as well says a lot. He was just super resilient, and I could see how he held his own against Smokes for so long before taking control. They were very enjoyable games, quite tactical, deep-thinking games. Notice both mostly using the full 7 minutes a lot of the time. And again, something I think you referred to in the Game 6 video, actually a comment from Stuff himself. First one to play in 5 will open the match up. But actually, I feel it was quite a risk averse match. He played a lot of strong corners, I played safe or half safe moves. And one way you could refer to that is us both being afraid to take risks. The flip side is, why take risks when you don't need to? If I could build out playing lock and he couldn't threaten it, why would I? If I couldn't set up well against Yuna in the corner, why wouldn't he play it? But basically, I think all games were played well, and to win, I had to really try something different and press hard. If Stuff decides to stick around and enter a few more tourneys, I think he'll go far again. I think I'm about done unless you have questions. Oh, I suppose a quick contrast. Compare my comments about this match being rather risk averse. That's almost the opposite of the previous match with Delhi. That's both a factor of the opponent and the rule set not really allowing safe moves, until I lucked into one. But that semis match was definitely way more chaotic, and I was having to find more creative moves to press or survive. In the finals, they were probably more what you'd describe as structurally sound. Not saying one is better or worse than the other, both were actually incredibly enjoyable matches for me, but the structured games certainly feel less stressful to play. Just a final general comment, probably. I'm delighted with the tourney win in general. Vincent is probably still my pinnacle, but this is close, and recency bias tells me it might be my best. Maybe because of the way I came through the match for Steli in particular, and then saw it through against an excellent Stuff, but also the very different nature of the wins. In Vincent, I recall I won most of my matches in one or two attempts, including the finals first time. This tourney had a lot of ties, and winning was incredibly hard work. So my favorite win? I think it'll always be Vincent for the memories, but this may well be my best one yet. I suppose another thing I could say is, back in 2008, if we played Vincent 100 times, would I win it again? Or was that just a perfect storm? My win maybe came before it was due, and yeah, I was on a great run of form then, but I don't know if I'd have been able to repeat it. Whereas now I feel, I don't know, more confident in my ability. Yeah, I definitely am. I think that's a nice place to end it. I think this was a great interview. Thank you so much to Turdz for sending me all this. My complaints that it was going to be a little too directed towards responding to stuff I said, I think was a nonsense complaint, and this was all excellent. And yeah, thank you so much to Turdz. Hopefully his opinions were interesting to you. This may be our last Triad Wars 16 coverage for a bit, though maybe I will squeeze a little more juice out of this orange. We'll see. All right, that's it for today.